For thousands of years, elders and knowledge keepers have used stories to educate future generations. Stories and words can help heal our hearts and make Mother Earth a better place for all people. This is Healing Hearts.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Koga, and welcome to Healing Hearts. Once again, we're so excited to be part of this project, working together with Immigration Partnership Winnipeg and Knowledge Keeper Clayton Sandy to bring together Indigenous and newcomer communities so they can share in conversation their lived experiences and learn more about each other. Today, we're going to be discussing land and treaty rights, what it has meant historically, and what it presently means today. So let's welcome our guests in Dennis Whitebird, Clayton Sandy, and Art Miki. And there we are. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome. So it's so good to see all of you. Like I said in the introduction, it's to bring Indigenous and newcomer communities together in conversation. We're going to be talking about land and treaty rights. So I'm going to start with, I guess, the man that has all the knowledge, Dennis Whitebird. You are the advisor for Grand Chief for the Manitoba Assembly of Chiefs, and you also are a former treaty commissioner. So Dennis, I guess there's so much history and there's so much stories behind what land means to the Indigenous people, but take us back, the importance of land and treaties.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here and to share a little bit of knowledge with each and every one of you. There is so much that is misunderstood when it comes to treaties, when it comes to the land, and when it comes to the newcomers and the settlers that came into our territory. So I want to be able to share a little bit of insight into that story. And do you want me to go right now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, the relationship is very, I would say very young. Canada has been in existence now for perhaps maybe less than 400 years, but our relationship with the newcomers goes back maybe only 500 years, and that's why I'd say it's very young. But it is surprising that we don't know very much in terms of that relationship and how we came to share the land and share the resources. So, and that's the part of the misunderstanding. And unfortunately, our Indigenous history has not been taught in the schools, and none of our values have been brought forward. And that's part of that whole misunderstanding that takes place, as well as language was a major problem between the nations that came forward. So I want to say that to begin the presentation. We all know that the humble beginnings of this great country are very much into the 15th century and 16th century. It is when the first voyageurs came into this area, and also the first explorers, I would say, came into our territory. And here on the prairies, I think it's a little bit later than that. But out of the exploration that took place, there was a trade that started to develop between the nations every year. And that relationship was dependent on each of the nations that were present, the Indigenous nations, as well as the explorers from England, the explorers from France, the explorers from Spain, and that's where it started. That's where it began. And shortly into that, there was a major economic boom that that began along with the fur trade.
Mhm.
And with that fur trade, the indigenous peoples or the First Nation people were the ones that were able to provide the product. And our product happened to be the fur-bearing animals, and the pelts were sold to the merchants, and they were shipped off back to England and back to the European countries, and where they were made into a finalized product, either hats or coats or whatever, gloves, and that's where it came from. And as that trade started to begin over the next 200-300 years, it became very clear that the relationship had to change somewhat,
Mhm.
and that there had to be some discussion on how the land tenure would be. And it was clearly understood as of 1764, 1763, and where they had the royal, I forget what the terminology that was used for, but in 1763, the Queen of England, which was, I believe, Queen Victoria, indicated to her settlers that happened to be in this country, and saying, before you can own any of that land in the New World, in that country, you have to have a relationship with the Indian people, with the First Nations people, and that relationship has to be based on a treaty. You have to undertake a treaty, and that was clearly a law from Great Britain. And from that grew this relationship, and the First Nations people were recognized as the owners of the land. And once they had that recognition, and they had to have a relationship with the queen, and that queen became understood to be the crown of Great Britain. And so that's where it started to develop. And with the making of treaties, you need two nations to make a treaty, and that treaty is spelled out in a very broad statement of an agreement. It's an agreement between the two nations, and that happened to be the Queen of England and the indigenous peoples living in this territory. So they made that agreement, and as well as with the agreement, they had obligations. There was obligations on behalf of the First Nations people. There were some promises that were made for First Nations people that this is the relationship that we will have. And it was very clear after 1764, the next perhaps 100 years, in 1867, all of a sudden a country is born, which we know as Canada. And once that country is born, and some of that responsibility, the government of England was still very much the decision maker. But they had a localized government here in Canada, which was, of course, that was slowly building in Eastern Canada. And Canada at that time was inclusive of maybe 5 provinces, which included Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and of course, Upper and Lower Canada, which was part of France and Ontario and Quebec. So those were the 5. And in 1867, a massive change happens. And Canada now becomes a part of the decision making for for the country. It forms a government. And out of that government, the treaty making process becomes a bit tainted. And why I say that there was never an agreement as First Nations people. We were always of the belief that when this treaty was made, we were the nation that made the treaty with the European countries, and particularly with England, because of the French and English wars in Eastern Canada. The English became victorious, and as a result, they were able to form the government of this country. And because of that, the crown was still very much in existence, and they took crown responsibilities. And as First Nations, we were of the belief that it was an international agreement, not a domestic agreement between Canada and First Nations people. And there was a misunderstanding as to how that land became described in the treaties. It was an agreement to share the land. And Canada wanted the land for the more settlers, more immigrants to come into the area. And they wanted to create a new economy, which was agriculture.
Wow.
And because of that, so they had to sit with First Nations, and starting in Eastern Canada all the way to the West Coast. And they were in the process of building a country from, I believe you often hear the term, from coast to coast to coast. So that is what they were doing. But at the same time, they wanted to do that at any cost, including misleading the First Nations people in the treaty dialogue. And it's part of the misunderstanding. So today we still have a major relationship with the Crown, with Canada, that we have a lot to settle with respect to that misunderstanding in terms of law and land.
Mhm.
And Canada, as I said, they wanted to create the country, so they had to come and see the owners of the land, which happened to be the First Nations people. We were the recognized owners because of 1763, the Royal Proclamation. That's what it was, Royal Proclamation. And because of that Royal Proclamation, it recognizes the First Nations people as the owners of the land, because they were here before the European explorers started to get here. We were already occupying the land. We were using the land. And today we still continue to use that land. It doesn't matter where we travel off reserve to go and use our home territory, wherever it is.
Wow.
So that's the whole concept. And for me, my relationship is to the land. It can be summed up very, very, very simply, that I am part of the land. That spirit of the land is within me, and that land is my food source. It is my clothing source. It is my medical source. Everything that I need is in the land, and that's how it was prescribed to us by the Great Spirit, and sometimes which we knew as the Creator, and we have that understanding that the land was provided for our sustainability.
Wow.
So that's the relationship.
Oh, we'll talk more about it, Dennis. And yes, going back into history and how so many lessons that we need to learn. And I guess that takes me to our next guest here, Art Miki, former president of the National Association for Japanese Canadians, and still such a vital role player in our Japanese community here in Manitoba. You hear Dennis's story about the history of the land and what it means to the Indigenous people. The same too, I think, with Japanese Canadians. And so Art, you're going to share your lived experience to really what happened to the Japanese Canadians back in the 1940s and probably even earlier. Art, you might be muted. Sorry, maybe just the beauty of virtual.
There we are.
Yes, there we are.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you,
Hi.
Tracy, and thank you for the invitation. First of all, I want to just say that the Japanese arrived in Canada very early, 1877, and the majority of Japanese who immigrated came just at the turn of the century, between about 1903 to 1908, was a major influx of Japanese at the time. However, I think coming to British Columbia, they never felt really welcome because there were discriminatory laws that were passed against all Asians, such as the right not to be able to vote. That was one of the big issues in our community, because without the right to vote, or without having that right of citizenship, they were deprived of entering into the professions. You couldn't be a teacher or a doctor. There were many things that you could never become. You could never work for the government. So hence, that was sort of the situation. And when the war began with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Canada declared war on Japan on the same day. And so right away, the Canadian government confiscated properties, mostly fishing boats initially. And they were all taken in and dry docked, and people lost their livelihood. In February of 1942, the government decided to remove all Japanese from the West Coast. So that meant that people such as my parents and grandparents had to leave their farms in the Fraser Valley and to move either into internment camps. Many people were sent to internment camps. Some people were sent to sugar beet farms, and that's how my family came to Manitoba, is because they were placed on sugar beet farms. Some people ended up in prisoner of war camps in Northern Ontario, especially leaders in the community who were deemed to have some influence were sent there. And as a result, we were deprived. And one of the things that took place was the confiscation of property. Property was taken, and when we look back at it, it's mainly because the intent of removing property from people was so that when they moved them out, they would never come back to British Columbia. And that was the way the politicians in BC were stressing to the government, get rid of the Japanese, we don't want them here in British Columbia. And so the taking of the thing that would draw people to where they want to live was property. And so that was all confiscated. People really never received much money for it. In fact, our community paid for their own internment. The government used the monies that they gained from all of this to pay for our incarceration. And so it's interesting that the government didn't really spend that much money in removing Japanese. As a result of that, people were scattered across the country. The initial intent of the government was to send all Japanese to Japan. Strangely, they realized that the majority of people were born in Canada. How do you send them to a strange country? And so that the government withdrew that legislation. However, some 4,000 people had already been sent to Japan by that time, out of the 22,000 people who were removed. And so it was that situation. People were scattered across the country. You could not go back to British Columbia until 4 years after the war ended. Many didn't go back because there's nothing to go back to. Our community in 1977 celebrated 100 years in Canada. At that time, people began to talk about their experiences and what happened. And the National Association 84 decided that that was an unjust treatment on the government using the War Measures Act to deprive Japanese Canadian of their rights. And we started a campaign to get the government to acknowledge that they made a mistake. And certainly we're asking for some form of compensation. Initially, our community was the one that was quite opposed to any action against the government. Interesting enough, I think that happened with many other groups as well. Initially, there's a reluctance to do that, but we felt there was a basic human rights violation that needed to be acknowledged. And so initially the government was really, they were prepared to apologize. They were prepared to set up some type of foundation in recognition of the losses. But our community felt that individuals who lost their properties and lost their livelihoods should receive individual compensation. So that became the big stumbling block for 4 years with the government. Finally, in 1988, and this is interesting, in the United States, very similar thing happened to Japanese Americans, and President Reagan signed a bill in 88 to give compensation to Japanese Americans. So we now had a precedent that we really pressed the government with, and they came around and called us back to meet again. And in September 22nd, Prime Minister Mulroney apologized on behalf of Canada for the unjust treatment of Japanese Canadians. And so there was a compensation package in which individuals received $21,000. There was a community fund. And one of the things that we felt is that as a minority group, when we were going through this whole process of campaigning, we did not have support. We couldn't go to the government for funding to help do our studies. In fact, they laughed at us when we asked for them to do research on our losses. And so we had to raise our own money to do that. But we felt that other groups in our country would have similar problems. And so we recommended and established the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, in which our community contributed half of the funds for a $24 million endowment, and the government put in $12 million as well. And so that was a legacy on behalf of all those Japanese Canadians who did not receive compensation because they had already passed away. So it was in our honor that we recognize that. So that's the situation with the redress parts, Tracy.
Wow. I mean, I have to say too, Clayton, yeah, you can jump in here too, but that surprised me, Art. Something that I did not know is that they just wanted to ship all us Japanese back to Japan, and not knowing that it'd be like me, I don't speak any Japanese. I'm born here.
But you know, when people look Japanese, and even today, I still get asked, when did I come to this country? When I've been here for 4 generations, or 3 generations, they still ask that question. So it's the visibility part. And so at that time, I'm sure anyone who looked Japanese had to be a foreigner.
So Clayton, our knowledge keeper, I mean, I guess, look, gentlemen, let's come into the present. And I want to field some questions here about just everything too as well. But Clayton, I guess, now bring us into the present, especially Dennis so eloquently talked about the history and the wrong that was there.
Okay.
And we really haven't righted it, have we?
Yes, yeah, it like I've just listening to the last 25 minutes from Dennis and Art here. It really amazes me how the history that I've learned in maybe the last maybe 8 or 10 years is nothing that I learned in school, like the real history. So it's always amazing how when we can actually sit down with with people that have that knowledge. And that's what I was always told. We go to our elders and we listen to the stories, and they're the knowledge keepers, and they have all this information. And that's the kind of information I think it's important for today's people to hear, that kind of information. And even though sometimes it's very difficult sometimes, but it's the truth. And when we talk about the truth and reconciliation, that's the piece that I say that's still missing is the truth, and getting our people to understand it. When I look at my generation and my kids' generation, this is information that they're just starting to learn. Last night I listened to Art's show last night, and there's a young man on there. Same thing. He didn't know a lot about his own Japanese history, and he laughed and understood about it. So yeah, it's so familiar. It's so familiar, just hearing that the information that was lost, and we're just slowly getting it back. And both of our fights are always with the government all the time. Basically trying to right the wrong all the time, and going through the same process, jumping through hoops and all that kind of stuff. When I first kind of really got involved with the Immigrant Partnership Winnipeg, that was in 2016. I met my friend Hanny, and at the time he actually I met him at a powwow. Immigrant Partnership Winnipeg came to a powwow on Broken Head, and I was dancing over there, and they had a table set up. So I went over and spoke to him. The first meeting we had after we met after the powwow, he was talking to me about a citizenship oath that the government that he was working on with the government, and part of that, I guess they wanted to include something about treaty in the oath that immigrants and newcomers take when they come to this land. I'll just read what they came up with. So it says here, so this is the oath. It says, I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. So that's the new oath that they came up with. And I guess right now they're still trying to pass that bill. And when I first met Hanny, it was 2016. So now we're in 2021, and he's still fighting with the government just to pass this. So it kind of blows my mind all the time how uphill battle it is just to change wording on something like it, which is true. Yeah.
No, it's true. Dennis, how important are treaties today? I mean, that might sound, of course they're important, but and how are they applied to life today?
Another big misunderstanding at the time of the explorers came into this territory, there was the Pope of the Roman Empire had passed these papal bulls, they were called, and as long as the lands that the explorers visited, as long as those people did not have a god, then they were not considered to be people, and that they were not Christian. And when they came to this land, of course they didn't know that they didn't realize our belief system. And as Indigenous peoples, we're very our way of life is guided by the Great Spirit, by the Creator, because of the spirituality of everything on the land, the spirituality of every single human being, and because of that belief, we believed in a Creator. We believed in a Great Spirit, but we didn't go to church to go and express that belief. It was wherever we were, and in fact, if we were in the standing by the lakeshore or standing in the bush, and we communicate to the Creator. And the reason why I share this story is because when the treaty was made, there was actually the two parties, which were the Europeans and the First Nations people. But what happened, the First Nations people, in order to endorse the agreement, endorse the treaty, they smoked the pipe.
Mm-hmm.
And the pipe is one of the spiritual ways that we communicate to the Creator. So what we have stated is, in the making of this treaty, the Creator was a witness to the treaty. And for us as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, we cannot break that treaty because the Creator was present. The Creator guided our treaty making process. So it's absolutely important today, as it was the day that it was deemed that they put an X on there. So it's still very significant. It's still very much guides the relationship that began because of that treaty. But we still have to work on the promises that were made by the Crown. And sometimes I say that in the treaty making process, that the Crown was, or the treaty commissioners that were given this role by the Crown, by Canada, used the Queen of England as their pawn, I'll say. Because every time they made a promise, the Queen of England, they said, the Crown in right of Great Britain, the Queen will protect her children, the Queen will provide, the Queen will do this. There was the Queen in every single statement that was made. Every single promise that was made, it was always in reference to the Queen will have this obligation. And here we are, Canada has that rule now. And Canada is neglecting to provide, to come up and speak truthfully about the treaty promises.
Well, I have a question here, and that probably for all of you gentlemen here is, how important is it for the government now to officially recognize and apologize for all the wrongdoings in the past? And I guess, Art, the government has sort of, Dennis, the government still has to, Clayton, is it just conversations like this that we as people will try to right the wrongs?
Yeah, it's interesting, Tracy, because when we were doing the campaign and we were doing the research, up to that part of our history, Canada had never recognized any type of compensation as a class action suit. And so we were the first group. And I recall when we were through negotiations with the government lawyers kept telling the minister not to do this, not to give compensation to community, because you're going to open the way for all the other groups. And so that was the biggest sticking point of the ministers of the government at the time, because their advice from their legal people was, you're going to open up a can of worms. Well, in the end, they did open up a can of worms. And shortly after, there are a lot of groups that received compensation. The Chinese head tax, Indian residential school is a good example as well. Compensation to the Indigenous war vets. I remember I had met with some of them for that. And so in a way, it opened it up for a lot of people. But I think it needs to be done. It's just like the treaty rights, the upholding treaty rights. Some agree saying that they were promised, haven't lived up to it. I think the government has an obligation to recognize it, even today. I know a lot of people argue, well, it's so late, why are you doing it? It's in the past, forget the past, that type of thing. But I don't agree with that, so.
Clayton?
Yeah, I find sometimes, when they come forward with an apology about something, even though it's words on a piece of paper, to me, I think the important part is action. If they don't actually put something tangible together that actually can make a change or do something different. That's the part. That's the piece that's missing all the time. Like they can apologize about anything, but when it comes time for action, that's where I think the rubber hits the pavement, and that's what I see sometimes. I find that the action isn't there, and that includes the truth also too. So they talk about the past, but about the wrongs that were done. But when it comes time to doing the rights, it's difficult for them to actually own up to those wrongs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How
I
important
could
is it?
just,
Yeah, go ahead, Art.
well, no, I think the word apology, I know that during our campaign, we never asked for an apology. We always said we want an acknowledgement that it's an admission. Apology could be given by saying, I'm sorry, but it's not admitting that you made a mistake. And that's what we wanted. So in our wording, we're really specific that, you know, you don't have to apologize to us, just acknowledge that you made a mistake.
Mhm.
Thank you.
No, you don't have to keep on saying thank you, guys. Well, Dennis, though, too,
Okay.
I'm thinking about truth and reconciliation. How important is it to have the monetary, or is it important to have the monetary acknowledgement, or is it just to have, like what Art said, admit that this was wrong?
Well,
There has to be there
ahead.
has to be a bit of an exchange. For me, I can get as Art says, I can get 1,000 apologies, and it doesn't really do anything for me. And let me give an example. I am a residential school survivor. I spent 12 years in residential school, and that's very much like taking me out of my own family, my own community. I lived beside my grandparents, and my grandfather was teaching us how to be good young First Nations people by teaching us the values and how to be respectful and how to be humble, but most of all, how to be truthful. And for me, that's the importance of, and that's part of the loss. I lost the love of my grandfather and my grandmother. I lost the love of my mother and my father, and even so with the community. And you take 20, 30 children from a small community, that's a huge, that's devastating for that community because there's no more children.
Mm-mm.
And there's the survival of that community is dependent on those children. So when that happened, when the children were taken away, it was to do a number of things. First of all, it was to teach us a new language,
Mhm.
to teach us about Christianity, but most of all, to teach us to think like a European thought, and not to worry about my treaty, not to worry about my land, and not to worry about who I was as an Indigenous person. That's what it did. They wanted to stamp out, and they used the term "kill the Indian in the child." It doesn't say kill the child, but kill the Indian,
Right.
which is who I am, my character, my value system. To kill that child within me, so that I think like somebody else. And to me, that has some value. I have to be compensated for that whole loss, because now I have to try and buy my way in to learn my language. Now I have to buy my way in to relearn everything that I've lost. And the same thing, the loss of use of our land, all the land that was taken. If it wasn't for the Indigenous agreement, the Indigenous treaty, there wouldn't be no Canada. And there has to be proper compensation for that land that was taken away from the Indigenous peoples. So for me, that's how it is.
Mhm.
You know, and our children are still being taken away. I'm sure that the audience have heard about birth alert, children being taken away right from the day that they're born. They're taken away from the parents and placed into someone else's home.
Oh, that's like, so is history repeating itself here, gentlemen? Clayton, too. I mean, this birth alert, and it's no different than the residential schools that Dennis was describing that happened to him.
Yeah, when I before I retired, I had an opportunity to work in Child and Family Services, and when they handed over the children from CFS, Child and Family Services, to First Nations and Métis, they handed over and blew my mind because I didn't realize we had that many children in care. They handed over 8,400 kids. That really blew my mind in Manitoba. Really blew my mind that they have 8,400 of our kids in care. Yeah, it just kind of just blew my mind, and I just wondered about. My heart always goes out to especially to the parents, to the mothers that have to that lose that child, and the damage it does to the whole family and the community. Like Dennis said, it's important again, to have that spirit. So that's what really bothers me sometimes, is that I see that cycle happening again, and I find that yeah, it boggles my mind that, well, when do we get out of this nightmare sometimes? Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's just so disheartening to hear. And, really, we want to encourage all of our viewers that are watching on Facebook Live to ask questions too. Art, I'm going to actually come to you now to talk about our community. I mean, certainly not anything as horrific and tragic, like as Dennis has explained, and what Clayton says is currently happening, but it's the assimilation of the Japanese in the community. And that
Right.
if we look at it, and I am a perfect example that I it's a biracial marriage, right?
Right.
And for me, it's been a wonderful experience, but there are differences too as well. So
Wow.
maybe just sort of your comments on that too, because you've got kids now and grandkids, and I think that's the Japanese way, right? We just want to fit in.
But I think in a lot of ways that was sort of forced upon us,
Mhm.
especially during the dispersal. Either it was go back to Japan, where most people had never been, or go east of the Rockies. And essentially, people just scattered all across the country, especially to Ontario. So when you look at our population today in Canada, we are split between east and west. There's about 50% that live in the prairies and BC, the other 50 in Ontario and Quebec. Unlike the United States, where their population, because the treatment was different, their population still mainly centers on the West Coast, like San Francisco and Seattle, all the way up the coast. We don't have one community in our Canada called Japantown, or where Japanese businesses thrive. There's none of that exists, mainly because of the fact that we were forcibly removed, and people were discouraged from living even near another Japanese when they moved east. They were told to assimilate as much as possible. So many of our young people never knew another Japanese person growing up. As a result, you've hit on the nail. There's an intermarriage rate of 95% in our community today. That means 95 out of 100 marriages are to someone from a different background. And so you could see what happens to your community. Our culture, the language, all of those things become diluted to a point where we're not too sure how long our community will exist in the future. We're trying to encourage our young people who are part Japanese to take an active role. But you look at the next generation when they're 1/4 or 1/8, then I think you begin to lose the community in itself. And so that's been the impact. Now, living in Canada, people say, well, that's great. That's multiculturalism. People are blind. But there is a price to pay when you do that, because there is that whole thing about identity that becomes an issue for individuals later on. So that's the impact of it.
Yeah, wow. And some more insight, but it's true. Like, who knows? Maybe at one point we'll all be the same. Maybe not male or female. I don't know. Maybe, well, definitely not in our lifetime. But I do have another question. I've got
Well, as
two.
long as there's a high immigration rate,
Yeah.
as long as it's a high immigration rate, it's likely won't happen.
Yeah, no. So I've got two questions here. One is just more of a statement, but it says, speaking of CFS birth alerts, there are so many bad things that have been happening still. How can we know things are going to get better? And I know that's a big loaded question. Clayton, do you kind of have a little bit more feeling like that on the ground
Well,
there? Things getting better?
Things have to get better, but I think it's important for our individuals to get better. And if individuals get better, their relationship gets better, their family gets better, and their household gets better. But that's again, there's still other things that impact that also too, in regards to poverty and no education. So there's all of those things that impede on that person getting healthy. So sometimes we just and I want to throw racism into that also too, because again, yeah, racism impeded in my 40 years career in government. But if so we have so many barriers, but all we can do is pray and help, like Dennis and I and whoever can help the next generation, get to know who they are. And once you get to know who you are, and maybe you might not know your language, but you start learning your culture through powwows or Sundance and all that, and it changes a person. So to me that's a big piece of it. Our people have to get to know who they are through their culture.
Well, you know what? Maybe a show like this could really help, because the second question is, what are some of the ways your communities are engaging young people to keep traditional culture alive? And I know Art, because of the close history that I've had with the cultural center during Folkorama and everything like that. But I think that now needs to be more. I think it needs to be hearing stories from Dennis, hearing everything from Art, and Clayton. You can kind of mesh it into a little bit more on this generation and the generations to come. But what kind of ideas come to mind, Dennis, on how you would maybe sit down with a couple of young people and teach them a little bit about history and more about the culture? What do you think is missing right now?
Well, one of the things that's really missing, but I know it's because of the pandemic. We cannot get together.
Mhm.
But once, hopefully, sometime in the future, we're going to have that opportunity. And as Clayton indicated earlier, one of the biggest teachers that we have is the powwow ceremony. And people of all ages attend the powwow because it's who they are. It defines their character, it defines their values. And the people that are dancing, a lot of people, those that don't understand what a powwow is, are saying, well, what are they doing? Why are they jumping around? But for us, that tells me a story. There's a certain kind of dance for that, another one over here, another one, and one strictly for ladies, one for young people, one for children. And it's of all ages, all age groups, right from the ground up. So we have opportunity, as in the past. I was just thinking as Art was talking, what Canada has done to the Indigenous community is they were trying to outlaw us out of existence. Every time there was a law that we couldn't gather, there was a law that we couldn't speak our language in the residential school. There was a law for us to leave the reserve. There was a law for us to have our ceremonies, everything like that. There was a law that we couldn't even go into the pool rooms. And very recently, in the last 20, 30 years, they still had some of those signs up in the pool halls that no Indigenous people could be in there. So it was, they tried to legislate us out of existence. But for us right now, it's very important that we teach our children, our grandchildren. We teach them about our value system. We teach them the language. We teach them the ceremony and everything that they need in order to have a bright future. So
Yeah.
that is our role right now. And there was when we were talking about the Child and Family Service Law, there's an opportunity right now, I think, for First Nations people to make their own law. And I think one of the ones that was recently passed was one in Peguis. They have their opportunity is they've made the law, and it's been recognized by Canada. And the only one that is not fully a part of that discussion is the province of Manitoba.
Hmm.
And yet, the province of Manitoba has the responsibility for family services, child and family services. They have that responsibility, but they haven't gone in to talk to Peguis. So how they will jump that fence when the time comes, I think it's going to be important. It's going to be critical.
Mhm.
And the same thing for each of the First Nation. We couldn't even, as grandparents, if our children came into care, as grandparents, we couldn't step in and take those children away. There was a law against that.
Oh,
So I think now it's kind of loosened up a bit. They're recognizing the grandparents' role and grandparents' responsibility for the children, and if we so chose. So
go ahead.
there's little tiny bits of opportunity that are starting to open, and we welcome that opportunity to take care of our own future.
Wow. And I mean, all these important things that should be written down or people should know about it. And I'm sitting here amazed listening tonight. Clayton, I'm going to go to you, and because I've been thinking about it too, bringing it into today. There's so many things that need to be fixed, and that'll take time. And yes, having conversation is the first thing. Racism, you talked about racism. It's reared its ugly head in all of our communities, and we have felt it. How do we kind of approach the young people now and getting them to be anti-racist, I mean, accept everybody as one, as all people, and art too as well. I mean, the Asian community has been hit hard during this pandemic and COVID, and mental health is such a big issue too now in all of our communities. We're heading into, I think, a new era where we're all going to have to be able to work together, I think. So I'll start with
I think one of the important things, and it's happening already is that there are a lot of individuals, organizations, and different places across Canada that are educating non-Native people and making allies.
Mhm.
And I find that until we're able to actually get into the system and educate non-Native people, non-native people won't hear these stories, and they won't get to meet people. Like I spent 40 years in government, and I've often felt in those 40 years, it seemed like non-native people were still scared of me for some reason. Like they never got to know me as Clayton. They got to know me as someone that they seen on Main Street or in the paper, or whatever. And they always painted me with that brush, and often thought that it wasn't until we spent quality time together they got to know me for who I was. So when I look around me and all the non-native friends I have, and allies that help me move things forward, those are the kind of people that we need, and they're out there, but they need to let their guard down and get connected with us. When I look at my children, and I look at their friends, especially their non-native friends, they just seem to be just like regular people now. They basically just get along, and it doesn't matter, if you're what color you are, what nationality are you are, if you're gay or whatever. They seem to just get along, and it doesn't seem to be a big deal anymore. So that's the point that I'm hoping that eventually we get to that point where people don't see us as individuals, and I mean don't see us as colored people, or whatever. But that's the point where we need to get to, and that's the purpose why I'm involved with this program. Like get the word out there and get people to ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And the first part of it is basically admitting that something's wrong. And I'm right now I'm part of the city of Winnipeg's diversity week coming up in a couple of weeks time. And it really pleases me right now just to hear the mayor say, last month that, there is racism at City Hall and within the ranks. And I try to get, I try to get government to say that for 25 years, but nobody would say that there's racism in government. And no, we're not racist. We treat you equal, but it's there, and we know it. But just say it, because if we don't say it, it never gets addressed. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Art?
Well, let's go make a comment related to that. I think I have more faith in the young people. They seem to, when I see young people out, there seems to be a lot more diversity amongst even small groups of people that I've noticed. When you go to some function, you can see that. I think it's that next group of people, the middle-aged group that still has these stereotypes in their head, and it's hard for them to overcome. And I know that Clayton and I have worked together to try to have some sharing circles with our community and his community, just so that they have exposure. And as Clayton says, it's getting to know the person that makes a difference. You can make comments about other people, but once you know them, that's a different story. They're like any other person. And that's the type of thing we have to really encourage, even with young people, is to encourage them to get together with other people. And we should provide opportunities for that. And but as I said, I think the present generation is likely a lot more open than they were the previous generation and the generation before that. So I think there's some movement taking place.
Oh, definitely. And Dennis?
I think that I can only say one thing, and that the truth will set us free. And I think we have to educate. We have to educate everyone that out there about and in order to really give the true history of our country.
Wow.
Thank
So
you.
getting back to Diversity Week, which is pretty exciting. It's March 21st to the 27th, and there's numerous kind of workshops, and of course it's virtual, so you don't have that energy of meeting people at first. Maybe share your own personal stories where people felt awkward, or you felt awkward, maybe just being so different in a room. And how did you kind of overcome that? And it could be like during in business, it could have been just a social, where you actually physically felt there was some discomfort or uncomfortability because of the way you looked.
I'll
Clayton,
share. I'll share a quick story with you.
Yeah.
One time, I asked this non-native guy. I said, "Did you ever go into a room with a whole bunch of native people, or a whole bunch of black people, or other minority groups? And have you ever been like the only person in that room with that group?" And he says, "Yeah, a couple of times." "How did it make you feel?" "Oh, I feel awkward. I don't know. Everybody's looking at me, and I don't know who to talk to." And I said, "Well, how do you think I feel every day when I'm in meetings with you people?" I said, "I feel the same way, and I live that all the time, and you only lived it for a couple of hours." So again, so it's important again just to sort of understand what we go through sometimes, and just by the way people just look at you and whatever, and it makes a difference. But I think I force myself to go out and just to talk to people. I force myself just to go up and just acknowledge people, whatever, and you can feel it right away. People don't want to talk to you, and that's fine also too. So then I'll go on to somebody else, So, but I always find people that want to talk. So
well, that's just you though too, but that is good information. But if you're not a great conversationalist, but Art, have you ever had an instance where you felt uncomfortable?
Well, I think a lot of times, you go into a situation where you're the only person of Asian background or even a visible minority. Yeah, she sort of, you have to overcome that. And I've always felt that, and I remember through negotiations with the government and having arguments and so on. And I think a lot of times they think, I remember one of the minister trying to pressure us. And he kept saying to me, "Don't you know I'm a minister?" And I said, "I know you're a minister, but that doesn't make you any different." And so we had this argument. But sometimes you have to do that. And even with some of the top ministers, we had some rip-roaring arguments about it. And we'd never back down, because once you back down, they got you. And so you just stand up as if you're part of them. And that's the way I used to try to handle things. So I don't feel awkward as very much that way, when I'm with a group of people. If something comes up that I want to say, I just say it. I don't think, "Oh, how are they going to look upon this?" You can't worry about what other people think, because you can't control that. So
Okay,
I
well,
think
you're coming with me to the next board meeting, okay? Oh, and
but anyways, it's how you look upon yourself.
no,
And
it's true.
you feel that it's an identity thing to
Yeah.
It's a self, what do you call it? You have to think that you're just as good as everyone else. Not
No,
you
no
were.
doubt.
Yeah.
And Dennis?
I've been in many situations. I've been in excuse me. I've been in a grade 12 classroom, and I was the only First Nation student. Excuse me, I'm having a coughing. But the one story I can share with you is as a treaty commissioner, I was invited to go and speak to speak to a group of municipalities. In fact, it was the Union of Manitoba Municipalities, and they've changed their name since. But they had all the reeves, the councillors from every single municipality in Manitoba. And there may have been one or two Indigenous people as part of the audience at the time. I think Churchill had an Indigenous mayor and maybe one councilman. Everyone else was non-native, and I was fearful, not for my life, but I was fearful that I was going to be attacked verbally or whatever. And as I walked in, I recognized some people that I grew up with in Minnedosa, and now they were sitting in positions of decision making. They were leaders in that community. but they were my fellow students. And of course, I went to mingle with them, and we exchanged stories. Oh, what you do? What are you doing nowadays? And where you living? That kind of stuff. So we kind of renewed in that little bit of time. And when I got up to the podium, I introduced myself, and I also introduced these group of friends from Minnedosa. And of course, they all cheered me on, and because they were good friends of mine, and some of them I played hockey with, and some of them I was in grade 12 with them, and so as it turned out, in my presentation to their fellow leaders, their municipal leaders, it became a really warm reception. You know, my fear was it was gone. And when I finished my message, of course, they had not heard about as well. When I talked about treaties, when I talked about the history of treaty, and as well as how it has spun around. Now they're the ones sitting there and they're talking about land. And so they were quite, it became a very good gathering, a good presentation, and I was welcomed for coming in to give my message. So yeah, there's been times, but a lot of times I've been into situations where I walk in and I'm uncomfortable, but it soon turns out that people are very interested to hear the message.
So the
So,
student,
yeah.
yeah, the student becomes the teacher. Well, I want to thank all of you for tonight. It's been an incredible conversation. And I think everything that has been talked about here, I'm sure there are going to spark more conversations. And that's what we want. We want people to talk beyond just our conversation here tonight. And, you know, we want to engage people. So thank you, Dennis, Art, and Clayton, for joining us here on Healing Hearts. And stay tuned, everybody. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have a brand new show on March 24th at 7 p.m. So stay safe and good night.